All righty now. Welcome to Dis and Dat, 12th of September. Time flies, we're having fun. In this section, it's the third part of uh, Michael Hudson's book, and it's available. We have copies. There's a link to it that you can see there, and we'll talk a little bit about the tableau économique. The idea, of course, is that it's essentially a grid or a matrix, and so from a math point of view, it actually makes a lot of sense. And modern economies, not unlike the use of the input-output table, are essentially structured like that. As I have said before, Marx had a spreadsheet or an Excel spreadsheet. I think things would have changed. The world would be different. So I'm going to read this third part. It'll go quickly. I think it only about 10 pages, and I will try to read it fast. But also we'll continue with the little article on Soren Mao's book, because some point we may read it. I don't know. As I was reading it, I went, I don't know if anyone should be. It's a little, I don't know. The books are getting a little harder to read in that sense. Anyway, Michael Hudson, The Critique and Defense of Economic Rent from Locke to Mill. The main substantive achievement of neoliberalization has, this first section is a quote by David Harvey. The main substantive achievement of neoliberalization has been to redistribute rather than to generate wealth and income. By accumulation of dispossession, I mean the commodification and privatization of land and the forceful expulsion of peasant populations. Conservation of various forms of property rights, that is common collective state property rights, into exclusive private property rights. Suppression of rights to the commons, colonial, neocolonial, and imperial processes of appropriation of assets, including natural resources, and usury, the national debt, and most devastating of all, the use of the credit system as a radical means of accumulation by dispossession. Note, of course, that dispossession, has an analogy here to estrangement and alienation. To this list of mechanisms, we may now add a raft of techniques such as the extraction of rents from patents and intellectual property rights and the diminution or erasure of various forms of common property rights, such as state pensions, paid vacations, access to education and healthcare, won through a generation or more of class struggle. The proposal to privatize all state pension rights pioneered in Chile under the dictatorship. Speaking of, September 11th, which was in 1973, the overthrow of the Allende government, is, for example, one of the cherished objectives of Republicans in the United States. They really haven't deviated from that particular position. It's the same, and it's just been codified in a variety of ways. You can see that in the Project 2025 document. Speaking of which, they had one of their stooges on CNN today. It was just, I guess they think it's balanced, but they really had, it's just horrible. They seem to think it's balanced when you have this one stooge from the American First, whatever it's called, Project Institute or whatever it is, and Paul Begala. Now that's balanced. The phenomena cited by Harvey represent opportunities for rent extraction. Neoliberals claim that such special privileges and expropriation of hitherto public assets promote economic efficiency. Classical free marketers define the rents they yielded as neither earned nor necessary for production to occur. They were a post-feudal overhead. The year 1690 usually is treated as the takeoff point for the classical distinction between earned and unearned wealth and its income stream. At issue then was the contrast between real wealth created by labor and special privileges, mainly post-feudal overhead, from which society could free itself and thus lower its cost structure. John Locke's guiding axiom was that all men have a natural right to the fruits of their labor. A corollary to this logic was that landlords have a right only to what they themselves produce, not to exploit and appropriate the labor of their tenants. Locke said, though the earth and all inferior creatures be common to all men, yet every man has a property in his own person. The labor of his body and the labor of his hands, we may say, are properly his. Whatsoever then he removes out of the state that nature hath provided and left it in, he hath mixed his labor with and joined to it something that is his own, and thereby makes it his property. For this labor being the unquestionable property of the laborer, no man but he can have the right to what is once joined to, at least where there is enough and as good left in common for others. All sounds very reasonable, John Locke. Locke wrote here as if most rent derived from the landlord's own labor, not that of their tenants or the economy at large. He also did not distinguish between the original conquerors and appropriators and their heirs. It was as if the benefit of earlier labor or conquest should be inherited down through the generations. Yet Locke's labor theory of property and wealth ownership set the stage for distinguishing between the portion of land rent that resulted from its owner's expenditure of labor and capital investment and what was received simply from ownership rights without labor effort. This contrast guided tax reform down through the progressive era in the early 20th century. Despite his conflation of former and present landholders' labor, Locke's exposition initiated a centuries-long discussion. By the 19th century, the rising price of land sites was seen as occurring independently of effort by landlords. The rent they charged reflected prosperity by the rest of the economy, not their own effort. Now, economists call this kind of gain a windfall. It's like winning the lottery, including in many cases the inheritance lottery of how much wealth one's parents have. Classical economists argued that labor and capital goods require a cost necessary to bring them into production. That is, labor must receive wages sufficient to cover its basic subsistence at living standards that tend to rise over time to sustain personal investment in better skills, education, and health. And capital investment will not take place without the prospect of earning a profit. Of course, more problematic are accounting for land and natural resources. Production can't take place without land, sunlight, air, and water, but no labor or capital cost is necessary to provide them. They can be privatized by force, legal right, or political fiat, that is, sale by the state. For example, Australia's richest person, Gina Rinehart, inherited from her prospector father the rights to charge for access to the iron ore deposit that he discovered. Much of her wealth has been spent in lobbying to block the government from taxing her windfall. It's like most of that kind of stuff, inherited wealth. Classical economists focused on this kind of property claim in defining a fair distribution of income from land and other natural resources as between their initial appropriators, heirs, and the tax collector, of course. At issue was how much revenue should belong to the economy at large as its natural patrimony, and how much should be left in the hands of discoverers and appropriators and their descendants. The resulting theory of economic rent has been extended to monopoly rights and patents, such as those which pharmaceutical companies obtain to charge for their price gouging. The history of property acquisition is one of force and political intrigue, not labor by its existing owners. The wealthiest property owners have tended to be the most predatory, that is, military conquerors, landed aristocracies, bankers, bondholders, monopolists. Their property rights to collect rent for land, mines, patents, or monopolized trade are legal privileges produced by the legal system they control, not by labor. Medieval land grants typically were given to royal companions in return for their political loyalty. This land acquisition process continued from colonial times down through America's land grants to the railroad barons and many other political giveaways to supporters in most countries, often for bribery and similar kinds of corruption. Most recently, the post-Soviet economies gave political insiders privatization rights to oil and gas, minerals, real estate, and infrastructure at giveaway prices in the 1990s. Russia and other countries followed American and World Bank advice to simply give properties to individuals as if they would automatically produce an efficient, that is idealized, Western European style free market. It didn't. What it actually did was to empower a class of oligarchs who obtained these assets by insider dealings. Popular usage coined the term grabbitization to describe red company managers getting rich by registering natural resources, public utilities, or factories in their own name, obtaining high prices for their shares by selling large chunks to Western investors and keeping most of their receipts for these shares abroad as flight capital. About $25 billion annually since 1991 for Russia. There's actually data for this, a significant amount of wealth that's held outside of Russia. This neoliberal privatization capped the Cold War by dismantling the Soviet Union's public sector and reducing it to a neo-feudal society. The great challenge confronting post-Soviet economies is how to undo the effects of these kleptocratic grabs. One way would be to renationalize them. Now, this is difficult politically, given the influence that great wealth is able to buy. A more market-oriented solution is to leave these assets in their current hands, but tax their land or resource rent to recapture portions of the windfall for the benefit of society. Without such restructuring, all that Vladimir Putin can do is informal jawboning, that is, pressuring Russia's oligarchs to invest their revenue at home. Instead of making the post-Soviet economies more like the productive ideal of Western Europe and the United States in their reformist and even revolutionary heyday a century ago, these economies are going directly into neoliberal rentier decadence. The problem of how an economy can best recover from such grabbitization is not new. Classical economists in Britain and France spent 2 centuries analyzing how to recapture the rents attached to such appropriation. Their solution was a rent tax. Today's vested interests fight viciously to suppress their concept of economic rent and the associated distinction between earned and unearned income. It would save today's reformers from having to reinvent the methodology of what constitutes fair value. Censoring or rewriting the history of economic thought aims at thwarting the logic for taxing yet rent-yielding assets. The physiocrats developed national income accounting, seeking to reform the French monarchy in the decades preceding the 1789 revolution. The physiocrats popularized the term laissez-faire, that is, let us be. Coined in the 1750s to oppose royal regulations to keep grain prices and hence land rents high, the school's founder, Francois Quesnay, extended the slogan to represent freedom from the aristocracy living off its rents in courtly luxury while taxes fell on the population at large. Quesnay was a surgeon. The word physiocracy reflected his analogy of the circulation of income and spending in the national economy with the flow of blood through the human body. This concept of circular flow inspired him to develop the first national income accounting format, the tableau économique, in 1759 to show how France's economic surplus, what was left after defraying basic living and business expenses, ended up in the hands of landlords as ground rent. Within this circle of mutual spending by producers, consumers, and landlords, the physiocrats attributed the economic surplus exclusively to agriculture. But contra Locke, they did not characterize landlords as taking rent by virtue of their labor. The crop surplus was produced by the sun's energy. This logic underlay their policy proposal, a single tax on land, l'impôt unique. Taxing land rent would collect what nature provided freely, that is, sunlight and land, and hence what should belong to the public sector as the tax base. The 19th century came to characterize landlords and other rentiers as the idle rich. But in an epoch where France was an autocratic state whose landed aristocracy was backed by the church and royal organs, it would not have been politically viable to claim that they did not deserve their rents. Hoping to promote a fiscal revolution by reformers drawn from the ranks of these elites, Quenet and his colleagues used rhetorical imagery to play on the self-image of rent recipients, calling this rentier class the source of France's wealth, with industry merely subsisting off the landed aristocracy's spending. Characterizing industry and commerce as sterile, that is, not directly producing the economic surplus, provided a logic for why landlords alone should bear the tax burden. Quenet's ploy was to claim that the class that produces the surplus is the natural source of taxation. Depicting agricultural land as the ultimate source of surplus implied that all taxes would end up being paid out of it. Deeming manufacturing to be sterile, that is, merely working up those raw materials supplied by nature, meant that taxing industry or the labor it hired would raise the break-even costs that business needed to cover. Any taxes on industry or labor would simply be passed on to the source of the surplus, that is, those agricultural landlords. In effect, the physiocrats said, indeed, you landowners are the source of our nation's wealth. That is why all taxes end up being paid by you, indirectly, if not directly. Let's avoid the convoluted pretenses at work and tax you directly by our single tax instead of impoverishing French industry and commerce. This is similar to the Georgist kind of plan, single tax. The physiocrats' analysis of the economy's circular flow of revenue and spending enabled subsequent economists to analyze this net surplus, that is, produit net, defined as income over and above break-even costs. They asked, well, who ends up with it and who ended up bearing the tax? Quenet's circular flow analysis describes what Husdon calls rent deflation. Like debt deflation to pay creditors, it is a transfer payment from agriculture, industry, and commerce to rent recipients that do not play a direct and active role in production, but have the power to withhold key inputs needed for it to take place, or from consumers. Now, Adam Smith broadens the physiocratic rent theory. Adam Smith met Quenet and Les Economistes on his travels in France during 1764 to 66. Remember, he writes Wealth of Nations in 1776. He agreed with the need to free labor and industry from the land rent imposed by Europe's privileged nobilities. And he said, ground rents and the ordinary rent of land are the species of revenue which can best bear to have a peculiar tax imposed upon them. But in contrast to the physiocratic description of industry being too sterile to tax, Smith said manufacturing was productive. In his lectures at Edinburgh, a decade before he wrote The Wealth of Nations, Smith generalized the concept of rent as passive, unearned income and used the labor theory of value to extend this idea to finance as well as land ownership. So Smith said, the labor and time of the poor is in civilized countries sacrificed to the maintaining of the rich in ease and luxury. The landlord is maintained in idleness and luxury by the labor of Husdon. The moneyed man is supported by his exactions from the industrious merchant, and the needy his tenants. The landlord is maintained in idleness and luxury by the labor of his tenants. Jesus Christ. Reading. The moneyed man is supported by his exactions from the industrious merchant, and the needy who is obliged to support him in ease by a return for the use of his money. But every savage has the full employment of the fruits of his own labors. There are no landlords, no usurers, no tax gatherers. Failure to tax this rent burden shifted taxes onto commerce and industry, eroding its profits and hence capital accumulation. In addition to bearing the cost of land rents, populations had to pay excise taxes levied to pay interest on public debt run up as a result of their failure to tax landlords. Ah, God, how hard is it to read these things? The major focus of value and price theory remained on land rent, primarily through the 19th century. In 1848, John Stuart Mill explained the logic of taxing it away from the landlord class. He said, suppose that there's a kind of income which consistently or constantly tends to increase without any exertion and sacrifice on the part of the owners, those owners constituting a class in the community, rejecting the moral justification that Locke provided for land ownership, that their land owed its value to their own labor. Mill wrote that landlords grow richer as if in their sleep without working, risking, or economizing. What claim have they on the general principle of social justice to this acquisition of riches? In what would they have been wronged if society had from the beginning reserved the right of taxing the spontaneous increase of rent? The value of the land rose as a result of the efforts of the entire community. Mill concluded that rising site value should belong to the public as the natural tax base, rather than leaving it as an unearned appendage to the riches of a particular class. Mill justified taxing land rent on grounds of national interest as well as moral philosophy. The aim was to avoid taxing labor and industry, but on income that had no counterpart in labor. In time, the labor theory of value was applied to monopoly rents. The remainder of the 19th century was filled with proposals as to how best to tax or nationalize the land's economic rent. Patrick Dove, Alfred Wallace, Herbert Spencer, Henry George, and others provided an enormous volume of journalistic and political literature. Short of nationalizing the land outright, these land taxers followed Mill's basic logic. That is, the first step should be evaluation of all the land in the country. The present value of all land should be exempt from the tax, but after an interval had passed during which society had increased in population and capital, a rough estimate might be made of the spontaneous increase which had accrued to rent since the valuation was made. An approximate estimate might be made how much value had been added to the land of the country by natural causes, and in laying on a general land tax, there would be an assurance of not touching any increase of income which might be the result of capital expended or industry exerted by the proprietor. When Britain's House of Commons finally legislated a land tax in 1909 to 1910, the House of Lords created a constitutional crisis by nullifying it. The procedural rules were changed to prevent the Lords from ever again rejecting a parliamentary revenue bill, but the momentum was lost as World War I loomed and changed everything. You can see how that at some moment the House of Lords, was protecting its own interests. Ricardo throws the banking sector's support behind commerce and industry. Every economic class seeks to justify its own self-interest. Even rent-extracting sectors claim to contribute to the host economy's well-being. Nowhere is this clear in the debate between David Ricardo, the leading spokesman for Britain's banking interests, and Reverend Thomas Robert Malthus, defending the landlord class and its protectionist corn law tariffs that raised food prices and hence the rental value of farmland. Hoping to strengthen Britain's position as workshop of the world, Ricardo pointed out that its competitive power required keeping down food prices and hence the subsistence wage. Urging the nation to buy its grain in the cheapest markets rather than remaining self-sufficient in grain and other food production, he developed what remains orthodox trade theory, explaining the supposed virtues of global specialization of labor. Ricardo's logic reflected the self-interest of his banking class. Globalization promoted commerce, which was still the major market for bank lending in the early 19th century. The crux of his argument was that labor's cost of living, headed by food, represented the main production expense for industrial employers. David Ricardo's solution was to replace the corn laws with free trade so as to buy crops and other raw materials more cheaply abroad from regions with more fertile land and other natural resources. This meant convincing Britain not to abandon the self-sufficiency in food production achieved during the Napoleonic Wars that ended in 1815. In Ricardo's hands, the labor theory of value served to isolate the land rent obtained by owners of allegedly more fertile soils who were able to sell their crops at prices set at the high cost margin of cultivation. He applied the same concept of differential rents to mines and natural resources. Attributing fertility to the original and indestructible powers of the soil, Ricardo claimed unscientifically that no amount of capital investment, fertilizer, or other action could alter the relative fertility of land. The landlord's capital investment could not avert the steady rise in differential land rent, that is, the cost advantage obtained by farmers on the richest and most fertile lands. Even further, Ricardo claimed, diminishing returns were inevitable as population growth forced cultivators onto inherently poorer soils. Rising food prices set by these last, presumably poorer soils taken into cultivation would provide a widening margin of rental income over and above costs, a windfall price umbrella for owners of more fertile lands. It followed that these sites did not require more capital investment by the landlord to obtain a rising share of national income. They didn't need to do anything. Ricardo's pessimistic agricultural assumptions failed to take into account the revolution in agricultural chemistry that was vastly increasing farm productivity, this fertilizer and et cetera. Guano. He insisted that even if fertilizer and capital improvements did increase yields, fertility proportions among soils of varying grades would remain unchanged. The best land would probably retain its edge even after capital was applied, and diminishing returns would still occur, forcing up food prices as more capital was applied to the land. The logic Ricardo outlined for why land rents would rise as populations grow applies much better to the rent of location for urban sites. The desirability of sites in good neighborhoods is enhanced by public infrastructure investment in transportation and other improvements, combined with the general level of prosperity. And most of all, in recent times, by bank credit on easier, that is, more debt-leveraged lending terms. Owners enjoy a price rise without having to invest more of their own money, the situation Ricardo described with regard to agricultural landowners. Now, Malthus's focus on how landlords invest their gains and spend on consumption. At issue was whether landlords use the rents that they receive in ways that help the economy, or whether high rents were just an unjustified burden. Malthus put forth two arguments to defend highly protected land rents. First of all, if landlords earned more, they would act like industrial capitalists and plow their gains back into their farms to earn still more revenue by producing more. Instead of being the unearned passive income that Smith had described, high rents enabled more investment to raise yields. What faith? Malthus credited the high crop prices protected by Britain's corn laws for enabling landlords to invest more in the land to raise output per acre. He pointed out that when trade in food was suspended during the war with France, that is 1798, the Napoleonic Wars, to 1815, landlords had responded to higher prices by raising farm productivity enough to meet domestic demand. The technology of artificial fertilizers and mechanization promised to further spur farm productivity. Assuming that protected income would be invested productively, Malthus chided Ricardo for treating the landlord's rent as the economy's dead weight loss when buyers of bread had to pay more. Contrary to Ricardo's description of rent as a, quote, transfer of wealth advantageous to the landlords and proportionally injurious to the consumers, Malthus countered that new capital investment in the land could not be afforded without high crop prices. And he says, rent and the increase of rent as the necessary and unavoidable condition of the increased supply of corn for an increasing population. Now, this assumption that higher prices would mean more capital investment to increase productivity has been the argument for tariff protection for many centuries, including by American industrialists urging tariffs to support infant industry investment. Sounds familiar. Now, Malthus's second point concerned consumer spending by landlords. Far from draining the economy, he argued, such spending was needed to save it from unemployment. Landlords were what today's 1% call themselves job creators who hired coachmen, tailors, seamstresses, butlers, other servants, and bought coaches, fine clothes, and furnishings. So even when rent recipients spent their revenues on luxuries, they augmented the demand for labor. This argument failed to recognize that if workers did not have to pay such high food prices, they could spend more on the products of industry. Or, if they earned only the subsistence wage, as Ricardo assumed, industrial profits would be higher at the expense of land rent. The real choice, thus, was between luxury consumption by the landed aristocracy or higher living standards for the rest of the population and more industrial investment. Now, John Maynard Keynes applauded Malthus's emphasis on spending by landlords or by government financiers or any other classes, showing the importance of consumer demand. But what Malthus described is best characterized as rentier demand by the 1%. He was justifying what the late 19th century cartoonist Thomas Nast depicted, that is, Wall Street plutocrats dressed in finery and so fat from gluttonous overeating that the buttons on their jackets nearly burst. The threat of rising land rent to impose austerity. Ricardo won the day, despite the fact that his theory of differential soil fertility and his belief in diminishing agricultural returns were diametrically at odds with the empirical experience of his time. His logic defining economic rent as the excess of price over cost of production shaped subsequent conceptualization of rent theory. Free trade ideology also involved persuading foreign countries not to protect their industry with tariffs and subsidies. The principle of buying in the cheapest market meant that they would rely on Britain for their manufactures and for their bank credit as well. After Parliament repealed the Corn Laws in 1846, Britain negotiated free trade pacts with foreign countries to refrain from protecting their own manufacturing in exchange for free entry into the British market for their food and raw materials. Ricardo's trade theory depicted this as a mutual gain. The problem, of course, is that buying in the cheapest market leaves the economy dependent on foreign producers. The long-term risk of dependency on imported food and basic consumer goods escaped Ricardo's attention, as did the problem of financing trade deficits by foreign debt. Ricardo never saw sushi, I suppose. Ricardo elaborated his concern that without such free trade, rising domestic food prices would push up the subsistence wage into a long-term pessimistic forecast. That is, the natural tendency of profits then is to fall. For in the progress of society and wealth, the additional quantity of food required is obtained by the sacrifice of more and more labor on those marginal soils. That's Ricardo. Falling profits resulted from higher prices for labor's subsistence. Falling profits resulting from higher prices for labor's subsistence would bring an end of accumulation, for no capital can then yield any profit whatever, and no additional labor can be demanded, and consequently population will have reached its highest point. Long indeed before this period, the very low rate of profits will have arrested all accumulation, and almost the whole produce of the country, after paying the laborers, will be the property of the owners of land, the receivers of tithes and taxes. In the end, Ricardo argued, landlords would obtain all the surplus income over and above the economy's bare subsistence wages. Industrial capital formation would stop. That is, the farmer and manufacturers can no more live without profit than the laborer without wages. Their motive for accumulation will diminish with every diminution of profit and will cease altogether when their profits are so low as to not afford them an adequate compensation for their trouble and the risk which they must necessarily encounter in employing their capital productivity. Now, Marx picks up on this, of course, and this seems reasonable to Marx that there should somehow naturally be this problem. Marx called this scenario the bourgeois twilight of the gods, the day of judgment. Importing lower cost food from abroad could only postpone economic Armageddon. As the American diplomat Alexander Everett observed, Ricardo's logic implied that diminishing returns would occur in one country after another as populations grew. Soil fertility in outlying lands ultimately would, forcing up food prices and hence the cost of labor, squeezing industrial profits, and then capital accumulation, and hence capital accumulation. From rent deflation to debt deflation, Ricardo's labor theory of value sought only to isolate land rent, not the payment of any interest. As parliamentary spokesman for his fellow financiers, he accused only landlords of draining income out of the economy, not creditors. So his blind spot reflects his profession and that of his banking family. That is, the Ricardo brothers handled Greece's first independence loan of 1824, for instance, on quite ruinous terms for Greece. And you could even argue that this has never been solved. Seeing no parallel between paying interest to bankers and paying rents to landlords, Ricardo sidestepped Adam Smith's warning about how excise taxes levied on food and other necessities to pay bondholders on Britain's war debt drove up the nation's subsistence wage level. His one-sided focus on land rent diverted attention from how rising debt service, that is the financial analog to land rent, that's not made clear to most people, increases break-even costs while leaving less income available for spending on goods and services. Treating money merely as a veil, as if debt and its carrying charges were not relevant to cost and price levels, Ricardo insisted that payment of foreign debts would be entirely recycled into purchasing of the paying nation's exports. There was no recognition about how paying debt service put downward pressure on exchange rates or led to a domestic austerity. In Parliament, Ricardo backed a policy of monetary deflation to roll back the price of gold and other commodities to their pre-war level in 1798. The reality is that keeping debt on the books while prices decline enhances the value of creditor claims for payment. This polarization between creditors and debtors is what happened after the Napoleonic Wars and also after America's Civil War, crucifying indebted farmers and the rest of the economy on a cross of gold, as William Jennings Bryan characterized price deflation. Well, he was talking about price deflation, but he was also talking about certain other things at the same time. But yes, it is a famous speech. The financial sector now occupies the dominant position that landlords did in times past. Debt service plays the extractive role that land rent did in Ricardo's day. Unlike the rental income that landlords were assumed to inject into the economy for luxuries and new capital investment, creditors recycle most of their receipt of interest into new loans. This increases the debt burden without raising output or living standards. Ricardo's critique of rent extraction was first used to oppose tariff subsidies for Britain's landlords, and then by Ricardian socialists such as John Stuart Mill to advocate taxing away their land rent. But renters have always fought back, rejecting any analysis depicting their income as imposing an unearned parasitic overhead charge on labor and industry, not to mention leading to austerity and depression. Today, banking has found its major market in lending to real estate and monopolies, adding financial charges to land and monopoly rent overhead. The financial counterpart to diminishing returns that raise the cost of living and doing business takes two forms. Interest rates rise to cover the growing risks of lending to debt-strapped economies, and the magic of compound interest extracts an exponential expansion of debt service as creditors recycle their interest income into new loans. The result is that debts grow more rapidly and inexorably than the host economy's ability to pay. So you can see there's a problem here that is of its own making, and in some ways is, comes from a sort of mistaken lack of sort of vision on how the entire economy works and also how globalization operates. And so you can see the Keynes in the tableau économique that everything has this flow, stock and flow sort of analysis. And then in fact, you can see that it is derived primarily from agricultural stuff from the soil. So and it's fairly easy to observe that, well, it's pretty palpable. It's just land, it's nature. And that financial things don't seem to be quite so natural. And so you can see that you have some ways in which the economy itself was derived. So yesterday we began reading Mao, M-A-U, Soren Mao, a book on sort of compulsion and capital. And we began looking at a certain kind of triplet ways and looking at a set of power and economic and social relations. So at the outset, one can observe two tensions the way Mao situates and theorizes the economic power of capital vis-a-vis the other key components of capital's power. One pertains to the rigidity of its analytical framework, which tends not only to reproduce rather than fully transcend the formalism of bourgeois thought, but also leads them at times to a necessarily stageist approach to capitalism, or to the power of capital writ large as a social totality. The other pertains to his method. Mao clearly sees the economic power of capital as historically specific. Only under capitalism have property relations been able to fully exploit metabolic precarity. But it is unclear how he views violence and ideology. Nowhere does he refer to the violent power of capital or the ideological power of capital, or clarify whether or how these are forms that are specific to the capitalist mode of production. And his analytical grid at times suggests that for him, violence and ideology are almost transhistorical. Now, these tensions could be simply linked to Mao's focus on the economic power of capital. Now, it's clear that he does not attempt to develop a theory of violence or ideology, and to the extent that he considers existing Marxist theories, it's mainly to highlight their neglect of mute compulsion. That's the title of his book. As a result, their differentiation from the economic power of capital is therefore necessarily schematic, but these tensions could also have a more significant roots. One is his theoretical eclecticism, and particularly the tension between his concurrent reliance on both value form theory and political Marxism, which at times pulls him in opposite directions. The former, that is value form theory, leads him to approach capital as a social totality and to add nuance or to relativize some of his conclusions, making clear, for example, that all forms of capitalist power operate together, or that violence is not necessarily superseded, but retreats into the background. The latter, and that is political Marxism, particularly the work of Ellen Woods, often leads him to reassert the binaries that are characteristic of her own work, or even though he himself endorses a far broader approach to class domination than her centering of surplus extraction, particularly her distinction between the different forms of appropriation characteristic of pre-capitalist and capitalist societies. That is, the former relying on extra economic force, the latter on the economic coercion of market dependency. Another is what he chooses to include in the natural laws of capitalist production, of the laws of motion capital. In another political Marxist move, for example, Mao denies that racial and gender differences are necessary elements of capitalism. Also excluded from capital's laws of motion is imperialism. For Mao, mute compulsion presupposes vertical class domination and horizontal competition between classes, but nowhere does he consider the question of how these manifest themselves at the international level and the ways in which capital's economic laws also entail a multiplicity of political forms, that is, uneven development, imperial domination, and inter-imperial rivalries. This exclusion partly stems from the fact that his discussion of imperialism mainly centers on those theories, particularly Lenin's, that associate imperialism with the monopoly capitalist rather than capitalism as such, and that see imperialism as a historical stage of capitalism rather than as a constitutive aspect of capital. In other words, at some moment, trade, you could argue that trade can be dissolved by greater efficiencies of capitalism, which sort of dissolves the notion that, imperialism would never continue. And in the fact, then the reality, of course, is that we have still versions of imperialism. Even here, Mao sometimes overstates the extent to which these theorists are incapable of grasping the mute compulsion of economic relations, which reproduce the power of capital, even in the absence of corruption and violence. This is now, without getting too far ahead of ourselves, this idea of mute compulsion, we could say, is a kind of Frankfurt School idea that is the idea that is pursued by Frankfurt School sort of theorists, that compulsion or legitimation occurs. There's kind of a self-repression that occurs, and that leads on to the much more advanced idea of certain sort of psychiatric views of how capitalism operates. Anyway, indeed, while Lenin's approach to imperialism as a stage rather than constitutive feature of capital is problematic, he was all too aware of the economic power of capital, even as he may have wrongly assumed that this was exclusive or specific to finance capital. And Mao says, Soren Mao, finance capital is such a decisive, you may say, force in all economic and in all international relations that it is capable of subjecting and actually does subject to itself even states enjoying the fullest political independence. In any event, the result is that Mao implicitly follows political Marxists in adopting an internalist view of theoretical analysis that restricts capitalism to the metropolitan core, rather than seeing capitalism as consisting of both core and peripheries in a mutually presuppositional, if contradictory, whole. Had he included imperialism in his analysis of the economic power of capital, he might have further nuanced the finding that, quote, direct violence and constraint is only prevalent at the fringes of capitalism, and this will be overcome when the rationality of capitalist economic relations becomes dominant. Indeed, if we track the evolution of global capitalism over the past few decades, we may find that the greater the expansion and dominance of capitalism, the more prevalent difference-making and violence have become worldwide. To hold otherwise would not only be to bracket the present moment as exceptional, but to transform the exception, that is, the absence of violence, into the norm. Bracketing violence and ideology, therefore, not only leads to an unfinished theory of capital as a whole, but also to an unfinished theory of the economic power of capital and of its necessarily imperialist nature. This is a small but important tension that we currently see. And, we live in a democracy that's relatively peaceful by comparison to actual war being carried out in places like Israel and Ukraine. Be that as it may, what I want to suggest is that I'll only continue for a few more minutes here. What I want to suggest is that looking at law and economic sanctions allows us to further reflect and to seek to overcome these tensions, namely the problem of analytic rigidity and historical specificity. Analytically, neither law nor economic sanctions fit neatly into any components of the violence, ideology, power triplet. Violence, ideology, power triplet, thus blurring the line between the three dimensions of capital and also complicating the muteness of its economic dimension. Law is at once a form of violence, ideology, and indeed, like mute compulsion, impersonal abstract domination, while economic coercion doesn't belong to any of these components, but seems to arise from the interaction between the three, among the three. Theoretically, these two areas suggest that all dimensions of capital are historically specific. An analysis of law shows that in all three dimensions, that is, violence, ideology, and mute compulsion, are historically uniquely mediated by law as a social form. An engagement with economic sanctions shows that their interaction also gives rise to new forms of violent and ideological political power that build on the economic power of capital. Theorizing law, including international law and economic sanctions, would also allow us to incorporate imperialism, race, gender, in our understanding of capitalist reproduction and develop a theory of capital as a social totality. But this last question I have to leave for a different space of time. Okay, well, we're going to get through this eventually, and we may spend a whole session on this one little article, which is a sort of a précis or critique of Soren Mao's book on mute compulsion. I mean, you can see the point of Mao's book is to address pretty much the same thing we were looking at before, is that, how are taxes, excised? Well, it's by law, it's by, power of the state. So you see compulsion built into this, and you can see a certain degree of not only symbolic violence in the form of laws, but actual violence. You send the cops around, the bailiff. So that's kind of the part of that. Let me stop now, because I've really run out of my usual time. Let's see if there were comments. Are we sovereign citizens? Well, yeah, that's yes. Mute compulsion, one of our worst characteristics. Yes, the failure, the consumption problems are just hard, hard to assess. I mean, there so much we sort of assume that exists, and we accept them. I mean, you could say that the current state of American politics is that we probably accept a lot more violence now than we used to, and that's unfortunate. I mean, I've been personal stories about this. Some guy deliberately got behind me in line at the supermarket and attempted to harass me on the basis of perceiving that I was an immigrant, even though I can't tell you how many decades I've been here, and that I had to point out that no, well, I think actually both my parents were born in this country, so really you can't try to insult me. It just makes no sense. But anyway.
But he tried anyways. Wow.
Oh yeah, I mean, I just people who, needless to say, the person accosting me was male, with all due respect, and had some agenda, I suppose, in trying to hassle me. I don't know whether he wanted to pick a fight or whatever, but it was just interesting to me. On the other hand, I was in public and I was in a supermarket, and they're just crazy people out there.
Yeah, clearly, yeah. Wow. So is mute compulsion an example of mute compulsion something like my belief in the American dream?
Oh, could be. No, seriously. I mean, if you construct it properly, this idea to have a house with a yard and with, whatever, all the trappings of it, is a dominant fiction or construction of the 20th century. And there's tons of literature on this, on, the social history of housing, suburbanization, sprawl, blah, blah, blah. All of those underlie why you go to why people used to go to the savings and loan and talk about, their mortgages and blah, 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 blah. All that is there. And what drives it, you could say, are these certain things that we sort of assume that, are not so much a birthright, but that are within our grasp, that there's opportunity for this. When in fact, the reality is that not all of us can be landowners. Not all of us want to be landowners, actually. That kind of thing.
Yeah. Yeah, sort of, I was going to say compelled. It's not compulsed, but in a sense compelled to follow that dream, but it was a fantasy.
Yes, and it's not always expressed openly. It has a lot of indirection built into it, and that's kind of the value form argument for Marxism, is that there are all these other things that are sort of not revealed, or that are operate in the background, like fictional capital, that we have, sometimes we capitulate to, and we assume we have power over it, but we don't. And that's the kind of issue.
Yeah. It has power over us. Yeah.
Um, it just, stuff happens. They don't seem obvious to people, or we assume there's so many sort of social constructs that we sort of accept, or whatever. Like I assume that people are not going to cost me standing in the line at the at the supermarket.
Right. Yeah.
It's not the first time that it's happened. And I go, okay, you read me as a person of color, so therefore you're going to make all these complaints, about whatever. And I'm going, I think in the back of my head, shall I tell this person that I really don't care? Your complaints mean nothing to me because they are, if you're going to insult someone, you really have to sort of know what you're talking about, and you don't.
Right. Yeah.
But anyway. Other questions, issues, brickbats, comments, interventions? So we may continue on with this. It's just a single article, and it essentially summarizes or synopsizes Soren Mao's massive. Well, it's not massive, actually. It's not that long. It's a nice little book. Mao's book, because it was only published like last year, year before last, or whatever. It's just another approach to, it could be just the old wine in new bottles. But I like the fact that people are still thinking about this and trying to work through this, and that's okay. I just wouldn't go, well, I wouldn't go following Soren Mao necessarily throughout all this, but it's another new book, and somebody does, you got to keep making books, I guess. So whatever.
But it seems like, Marx came to the critical realization here that, this capitalism thing is broken.
Yes.
Even with a smaller set, just looking at like agriculture.
Oh, yes, absolutely. I think he was quite observant about these things. And he was at this moment where not just he, but a whole bunch of other people, as we know, were running around trying to go, God, society's screwed up. We got to sort of, how are we going to fix this? And and then people did it in their own ways. You have guys going around just counting every problem that trying to structurally deal with some of urban problems, etc. So, that it was a very exciting time, I guess. I would say that the current time is very exciting, but I think that we sort of have overproduction of I think Marxism has its overproduction issues as well. Anyway, no, but I agree with you. And are there other comments or questions, or are we ready to leave the live stream? Oh, wait a second. Somebody put something up here. Anna did. Yes. Oh, yeah. No, seriously speaking, I am quite frightened about being out there with a scarf, because some people automatically misinterpret scarf wearing. Especially if you actually draw it over your head. If you just have it around your neck, that can be sort of okay, but people are nuts.
Yes, thank you, Anne. And I also had some thoughts about privatizing natural resources, because that worked out so well in Hungary in the 90s and ever since.
Yes.
But anyway, thank you.
Well, it just throws everything into sort of bizarre commodification, and as I've tried to point out in yakking about other stuff.
Yes, and then if you pour a pot of corruption over the whole story.
Oh, indeed.
Then it gets outrageous.
Yes. Well, there's a formal economy, and then there's layers of informal economy, and people don't like to identify what that is. Yet we invest it with an incredible amount of meaning. In other words, we romanticize gangsterism, right? I mean, it's the crux.
The Wild West.
Yeah. Well, it's. I mean, the tension that goes on in narratives, whether it's space narratives or romantic narratives or romanticized historical narratives, it has all those elements built into it, and we indulge them. I mean, personally, I try not to indulge too many of them because probably have too many indulgences, but it is it's all there. It's unfortunate. People don't like to measure the informal economy, but it's worth measuring. It should be measured more.
Yeah.
Uh,
But how?
I mean, so much happens that kind of is working around, it's just other things are going on. And it's not like, being paranoid or anything. The fact is other things do go on. A lot of people still operate, with barter, for example, that you don't add a whole bunch of a set of exchanges in the economy with tips. I mean, if
Mhm.
you just want
Yeah.
to look at
And also, you spoke about social capital just the other week,
oh
like
yeah,
a week
indeed.
or two ago.
I
And
want to I
That
want a
too is
little
like
bell to go off
super
when I'm
important.
starting.
But how do you measure it?
I want a bell to go off when I start making surplus value.
Well, you could actually design something to do that. It would be
For
kind of
all
a
of
cute
us,
argument. Oh, indeed. I don't know. Absolutely. I mean, we're all free agents on the one hand. On the other hand, we are constrained by a whole bunch of things. Okay. Well, I'm at
Yeah, I
the
was
end of my.
constrained earlier today
How's that?
with work.
Oh, yes, indeed. Well, they don't call it wage slavery for nothing, right?
Right, yeah.
Um, Okay, let me terminate our live stream so we can be more